Mr. Secretary General Kofi Annan, Prime Minister Paul Martin, it is a great pleasure for me and a privilege to introduce this morning two personalities for whom we all have great admiration. First, I would like to welcome the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, once again in Davos as a very good friend, a person who reflects by his actions the true embodiment of a man committed to improving the state of the world. We are very honored to have you with us, the Secretary General of the United Nations, because His Excellency Kofi Annan is characterized by quite a number of dimensions. He's a leader whose role in promoting multilateral cooperation in the world is unequaled. He's a leader who has steered the United Nations through its most difficult challenges in recent history. He is a leader who worked tirelessly to revitalize the United Nations through a comprehensive program of reform. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, there's perhaps no other leader in the world better positioned to share with us his vision on the future of global interdependence. I also welcome back to Davos Prime Minister Paul Martin. It is even a greater pleasure to welcome you back because now you are the Prime Minister. You have assumed your office just 1 month ago. We congratulate you on your new post, one that holds such great promise, not only for Canada, but for the rest of the world. You bring to your current post an impressive history of tremendous accomplishment, experience, and knowledge as a business leader and after a brilliant career in politics, where you have been Finance Minister of Canada and you had an unparalleled record in a very difficult situation of erasing a multi-billion-dollar deficits and bringing about 5 consecutive budget surpluses. So a role model probably for many here. Prime Minister, I should also mention your role as an international leader and statesman with your commitment to the G20, reforming, you were the first chairman, and recently as the co-chair of the United Nations Commission on the Private Sector and Development. You are a visionary leader, and we know that inside the G8 you will have a particular role to play, and inside the G20 in the coming years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome very cordially the Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, and the Prime Minister of Canada.
Mr. Prime Minister, Klaus Schwab, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed very good for me to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you again this morning. Nan and I always look forward to coming back to Davos. 5 years ago here in Davos, I asked you, the world business leaders, to join the United Nations on a journey. You were already well embarked on a journey of your own on the road to globalization. At that time, globalization appeared to many to be almost a force of nature, and it seemed to lead inexorably in one direction, ever closer integration of markets, ever larger economies of scale, ever bigger opportunities for profits and prosperity. And yet, even then, 10 months before Seattle burst onto the scene, I felt obliged to warn that globalization would be only as sustainable as the social pillars on which it rested. Global unease about poverty, equity, marginalization was beginning to reach a critical mass. I was concerned that unless global markets were embedded in shared values and responsible practices, the global economy would be fragile and vulnerable to backlash. That was why I urged you, as a matter of enlightened self-interest, as well as common interest, to work with us to build and fortify those social pillars. I emphasized in particular the areas of human rights, labor standards, and the environment, on which your activities have such direct and major impact. I called then for a compact, not a contract, not a code of conduct, not a set of regulations or new system of monitoring, but a concrete expression of global citizenship. I was looking for something that would strengthen the economic openness that business needs to succeed, while also creating the opportunities that people need to build better lives. I am pleased that so many of you stepped forward to embrace the leadership challenge and to internalize the Compact's principles into your operations. Today, more than 1,200 companies are involved from more than 70 countries, North and South, and from virtually every sector of the economy. Civil society organizations and global labor movement have joined in the effort to make the Compact work. Governments are also supporting our effort. The Compact has inspired dozens of practical initiatives on some of the key issues of our times, from AIDS awareness to anti-corruption, from e-learning to eco-efficiency. It has generated investment in some of the world's poorest countries, and it has opened the doors of the United Nations itself to new forms of partnership and many different stakeholders. Yet, much more can be accomplished and must. With that in mind, I am convening a Global Compact Summit in New York this June to reassess and reposition our efforts aiming at higher levels of achievement. Dear friends, even as we deepen and expand the Compact's mission, the global landscape around us is shifting profoundly and in some respects adversely. Today, not only the global economic environment, but also the global security climate and the very conduct of international politics have become less favorable to the maintenance of stable, equitable, and rule-based global order. So I have come before you again, asking you to embrace even bigger challenge as leaders of profit-making enterprises, to be sure, but also as global citizens with enormous interest at stake. Economically, we see dwindling investments in those parts of the developing world where it is needed most, coupled with trade negotiations that have failed so far to eliminate the system's egregious biases against developing countries. On the security front, international terrorism is not only a threat to peace and stability, it also has the potential to exacerbate cultural, religious, and ethnic dividing lines. And the war against terrorism can sometimes aggravate those tensions, as well as raising concerns about the protection of human rights and civil liberties. As if all that were not enough, the role of the United Nations itself, the efficacy of its charter, and the system of collective security are now under serious strain. In just a few short years, the prevailing atmosphere has shifted from a belief in the near inevitability of globalization to deep uncertainty about the very survival of our global order. This is a challenge for the United Nations, but it obliges the business community too to ask how it can help put things right. Allow me to suggest some ways that you might do your part. In the economic realm, there is a direct connection between your interest and the international community's ability to meet the Millennium Development Goals. The goals are central to our struggle for peace and human dignity. Yet, in the past year or two, the war in Iraq and other events caused our attention to drift dangerously away from them. It is time to rebalance the international agenda. The goals offer a compelling platform for business involvement. The target for water, for example, is to cut in half by 2015 the proportion of people living without access to clean water. That requires making 270,000 new connections per day until then, something that governments, NGOs, and development agencies alone cannot do. I could give you similar numbers for many of the other targets and for the broader development investments needed to achieve them, from energy to telecommunications. The goals are intended first and foremost to help people, but they can be good for business as well, because helping to build the infrastructure is an enormous business opportunity, and second, because once it is built, business will find larger and eager markets in place. I should stress that the Global Compact is not only the only current UN initiative which aims to mobilize the great capacity of the private sector in our fight against poverty. As you heard earlier, last July, I asked the UNDP, United Nations Development Programme, to convene a commission on the private sector and development. Prime Minister Martin, I would want to thank you for the dynamism you have brought to the Commission's work, along with your co-chair, former President Ernesto Zedillo of Mexico. I know that you and your colleagues from the business and policymaking communities have been working hard at all the key questions, in particular, how multinational business can become a supportive partner for local entrepreneurs and help developing countries to build up their own interdependent and independent private sectors. I'm sure you will give us solid recommendations that will help us tackle this key development challenge, and I look forward to the Commission's report in the months ahead. Business also has the great potential to influence the arena of trade. Business can and should use that influence to help break the current impasse in the talks. More than anything else, we need a deal on agriculture that will help the poor. No single issue gravely imperils the multilateral trading system from which you benefit so much. Agricultural subsidies skew market forces. They damage the environment, and they block poor country exports from world markets, keeping them from earning revenues that would dwarf any conceivable level of aid and investment flows to those countries. For all our sakes, and for the credibility of the system itself, they must be eliminated. We also need your help in efforts to manage threats to peace and security, particularly through your operations in countries afflicted by conflict. Business must find ways of reducing the contribution, sometimes conscious, sometimes inadvertent, that firms make to fueling conflicts which are often related to factional competition for control of natural resources. Business efforts to promote transparency and fight corruption can help to prevent conflict from happening in the first place. Business also has a powerful interest in helping to rebuild our system of collective security and thus prevent the world from sliding back into brute competition based on the laws of the jungle. You know all too well how much business confidence depends on political stability and security. I hope, therefore, that you will support the work of the high-level panel, which I have asked to make recommendations on ways of dealing with threats and challenges to peace and security in the 21st century. People have described this panel as a panel on UN reform. It may indeed propose changes in the rules and mechanisms of the United Nations. But if so, those changes will be a means to an end, not an end in itself. The object of the exercise is to find a credible, convincing collective answer to the challenges of our time. The Charter of the United Nations is very clear. States have the right to defend themselves and each other if attacked. But the first purpose of the United Nations itself, laid down in Article 1 of its Charter, is to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace. We must show that the United Nations is capable of fulfilling that purpose, not just for the most privileged members of the organization who are currently and understandably preoccupied with terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. The United Nations must also protect millions of our fellow men and women from the more familiar threats of poverty, hunger, and deadly disease. We must understand that a threat to some is a threat to all and needs to be addressed accordingly. I urge you all to tell your governments just how important this is to you as business leaders and try to persuade them to support the panel's recommendations when they are published later this year. Indeed, the United Nations is not an end in itself, as I have said. It is a means for building a better world through reliance on universal principles such as justice, respect for international law, and the peaceful resolution of disputes, and the day-to-day work of translating those principles into action. To succeed in that mission, however, political leaders need to develop a deeper awareness of their dual role. Each government has a responsibility towards its own society. At the same time, governments are collectively the custodians of our common life on this planet, a life that all citizens and citizens of all countries share. Each of us needs to promote that understanding. All of us need to work together towards that end. I applaud the World Economic Forum for its efforts to engender a new concept of corporate leadership concerned with creating public value as well as private profit. I also applaud the World Social Forum for drawing attention to those members of human family who have least, need most, and yet lack a voice. And I hope that a way will soon be found to establish links between these two communities. For all the differences between them, they are united by a shared interest in a global order that is equitable, that is governed by the rule of law, and that reflects the needs of all the world's peoples. Let each of us and all of us make that our overriding aim. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Secretary General particularly also for this appeal to us, the business community, to exercise really global citizenship. And now the Prime Minister of Canada has the floor.
Secretary General, Dr. Schwab, thank you very much for the introduction. My job is to essentially talk to you a little bit about political mechanisms in an interdependent world to help us make difficult decisions. I had a difficult decision to make this morning. I've got to let you know, when I woke up this morning, Sheila, my wife who was with me, said, "Now you're not going to wear a tie. Dr. Schwab says you cannot wear a tie." I found out that the Secretary General was going to wear a tie, and such is my support for the United Nations. What I'd like to do is to talk to you about the need to make the practice of politics more effective at the international level so that indeed the benefits of global interdependence are spread more fairly. At its best, which you know as well as I is not always the case, the domestic political process is open and full of energy. It's about making the right choices among competing interests and priorities, choices which ultimately reflect the way ahead. Domestically, debates and trade-offs occur. They occur in our cabinets, they occur in our legislatures, they occur in our town halls with our citizens, and eventually decisions are made and implemented. Now, I say all of this because when we look at the international scene, it is strangely unpolitical. To a remarkable extent, the dialogue among nations is technocratic, it is indirect rather than open and free-ranging. It's more often concerned with preserving process than with breaking new ground. It is a dialogue that in the great international meetings that so many of you have attended, I must say, and it's the great advantage of the World Economic Forum that it is not this way, but in most of the great international meetings that I attend, in any event, the dialogue too often proceeds only from set pieces read aloud. And when leaders meet in international fora, it is difficult for them to break free of the briefing book syndrome. And it's difficult for them to get down to brass tacks and to think out of the box. And thus, it becomes very difficult at such gatherings to make the leap of faith which is so often required to break an intellectual or a historical logjam. Doesn't mean that progress doesn't occur. It's just that sometimes it is very, very slow, painfully so. And so, thus, in the context of global interdependence, I believe that the time has come for us to examine not just the decisions we make, but the decisions that we don't make, and then ask ourselves why that is. And what I'd like to do is to give you 3 examples where I believe the debate between political leaders must be lifted from the page, must go from pro forma to real commitment. First, the dilemmas created by the collision, these are the examples. First, the dilemmas created by the collision between the legal principle of state sovereignty and the growing recognition that outside intervention may at times be necessary to protect people from humanitarian disaster. Humanitarian disaster when their own governments are either unwilling or unable to do so, or in fact may be the actual cause. When a government violates all accepted standards of responsible behavior, the question is, do we, the international community, have a responsibility to protect? In this case, the responsibility to protect a country's people from its own government. Now, a recent international commission of experts reported to the United Nations, I don't know if Gareth Evans is here, that we do have the responsibility to protect. And it set out various types of acceptable intervention, including measures such as sanctions on the one hand, and military intervention under certain conditions, including acting under the right authority. We in Canada find ourselves very much in agreement with the Secretary General, with Kofi Annan, when he said, and I quote, "Surely no legal principle, not even sovereignty, can ever shield crimes against humanity." We believe that humanitarian intervention under compelling circumstances such as Rwanda or Kosovo is warranted. We reject the argument that state sovereignty confers absolute immunity. But we are also sensitive to the fears of some that the concept of intervention can be misused. What is required is an open discussion about the need for intervention in situations that offend the most basic precepts of our common humanity. Even more to the point, we feel that we need clear agreement on the principles to help determine when it's appropriate to use force in support of humanitarian objectives. We know that there has been a disagreement about Iraq, but that should not shut our minds to the wider debate that is necessary. And the simple point that I would make about this wider debate, which raises the most profound political and moral questions about the nature of states and our responsibility to one another, is that it cannot be left only to experts and diplomats. They must prepare the way, to be sure. But the debate will simply not proceed as it should, nor will it reach a conclusion, unless political leaders at the highest level take it in hand. A second example, where an intellectual leap is required and where only political leadership can provide it, arises out of the collision between intellectual property rights on the one hand and the need to provide low-cost medicines to the poorest nations in the world on the other. The need for intellectual property rights is undeniable. They are the results of huge research and innovation. They encourage and they protect investment. They ensure that our scientists, artists, and inventors receive a just reward for their dedication and creativity. But there is also a moral obligation to help relieve someone's suffering if we are able. And it is wrong, it is simply wrong, to let people die because they don't have the wherewithal, the money, to find a solution to their suffering. Where do we strike the balance? Well, work is underway. There's a global campaign to provide cheap medicine against HIV/AIDS. In Canada, we will soon be passing legislation that will allow Canadian companies to provide generic anti-HIV/AIDS drugs to African countries at low cost. And these are important initiatives, but they only get us part way. In Canada and other developed countries, and in most developed countries, we all have systems to ensure that medicines for everyone who needs them. We both sustain intellectual property rights on the one hand, and we provide medicines for the poor on the other. Developing countries, however, cannot afford such systems, and there is no global system in place that can protect intellectual property rights while also ensuring that medication reaches the poorest among us. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, must every case of need, must every new disease spark a new debate? Or can we have an open political discussion that maps out general principles so that the world can react compassionately and comprehensively to new health crises? La question est simple. Notre humanité s'arrête-t-elle à nos frontières? Et la réponse doit être aussi claire, bien sûr, que non. The question is, does humanity stop at a nation's border? And we all know that the answer to that question is no. And thus, I would suggest to you that we have to broaden our traditional ideas about the responsibility of sovereign states, not only the responsibilities of the rich to the poor, but of all countries towards each other. And this leads me to my third example of the kinds of dilemmas posed by modern interdependence, our stewardship of the global commons of the resources that are the common heritage of all mankind. Civilized countries no longer allow the unregulated pillage of their own natural resources. The question is, why do we allow the pillage of international resources? One appalling example, for instance, is overfishing on the high seas. We were once very guilty of this in Canada, but we have taken tough measures to stop it. And we are pleased that the European Union recently ratified the UN's Convention on Straddling Stocks. But there are still countries, some poor, but incredibly so, a number of very, very rich nations that are not doing nearly enough. In those cases, again, the politics of responsibility again seems to stop at national borders, and that's no longer acceptable in an interdependent world. The first obligation of a sovereign state is to its own citizens. That's clear. But just to do that properly in an interdependent world, states have to be engaged beyond their borders. Further, all states today have as well a real and legitimate stake in the welfare of other countries, and that confers a special obligation on political leaders to make our international systems work for the welfare of all. And this brings me back to the question I put at the beginning of these remarks. What are the institutions? What are the structures that will allow leaders to engage as a political community? The problem with many of today's international meetings is that they are not designed to facilitate the kinds of informal political debates that must occur. More to the point, if the international fora at which bold decisions are required remain focused only on the ratification of bureaucratic negotiation with little political push, the tendency will be to use them as an excuse for inaction. In short, photo ops are no substitute for political will. Political leaders must work with each other internationally the way they work at home, when they work well, that is. That's debating, exploring, searching for value-driven solutions that are inclusive rather than divisive, stabilizing rather than destructive, pragmatic rather than ideological. This was the thinking that motivated us when Canada worked with other nations, as Dr. Schwab said, to establish the Group of 20 in the wake of the Asian financial crisis. We foresaw an informal gathering of finance ministers from all regions of the world, representing very different political, economic, cultural, and religious traditions. It has worked well because the finance ministers are able at the table to bring peer pressure on one another to force decisions that otherwise would not be made. For instance, it was at a G20 finance ministers meeting that the Washington Consensus on Financial Liberalization was modified to include the need for stronger social programs, healthcare, education, and to do so on a parallel basis at the same time. And this became known as the Montreal Consensus. The main objective for the G20 was to bridge the divide between the us and the them that have harmed so many international meetings. For instance, we saw the problem most recently at the World Trade Organization meeting in September in Cancun, when the G22 caucus of developing countries took on the major developed nations over the issue of agriculture, as the Secretary General has just mentioned. Now, each represented only one side of the issue, and the talks failed. And I just ask you to think of how much better it would have been if the major players on both sides of the agricultural divide had been at the same table with a track record for some time of discussing complex issues, forcing debate to needed conclusion. Now, somebody may say, well, it did come to a needed conclusion, simply that that conclusion was negative. But let me say that very occasional meetings, simply designed for a specific topic, are not the kinds of meetings that are going to bridge a divide. If you believe that progress on these tough issues is in everybody's interest, then we have to get the right mix of countries into the same room at the same time, and most importantly, on a regular yet informal basis. We need some soul searching. We need some head knocking. Above all else, some honest talk about what kind of a world we want 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road. We are not going to do that with 100 countries around the table, nor are we going to do it in small groups if the leaders are absent. I don't think that we can ignore the G20 experience. I don't think that we can ignore the G8 experience, where finance ministers and foreign ministers at different meetings meet a number of times a year. The finance ministers meet 4 times a year. They get to know each other. They are not bound by bureaucratic restriction, and they are able to discuss things across the table and make progress. I believe that we have to understand the importance of political leaders meeting away from their bureaucrats in an informal setting. I think it's the only way that countries with different perspectives can find common ground and work to common purpose. And this takes me to my second line of attack. Because while a G20 or a G8 can drive the agenda, it cannot replace our international institutions. We need multilateral institutions that work, not as ideological ends in themselves, but as indispensable instruments of national well-being. No one nation can manage the consequence of interdependence on its own. We can work with our neighbors, we can work with our friends and our allies, we can work with our regional and global partners, but work together we must. And at the center of this international network sits the United Nations. And if the United Nations doesn't work, then let's not kid ourselves. The work of every single national capital in the world will be severely hobbled. We talk about the role of the United Nations in bringing multilateral fora together and bringing countries together to work in a multilateral base. But for most of us, the accomplishment of our national goals in an interdependent world has to pass through the United Nations. L'ONU occupe le centre de la vision planétaire, une vision qui mérite toujours d'être défendue. The United Nations has to work because it reminds us, like no other institution could, that all nations have interests that demand recognition and that all nations have responsibilities towards each other that they cannot shirk. The UN stands at the center of the global vision that says either it works for all or it doesn't work at all. The mandates, and this is referred to by the Secretary General, the mandates, the structures, and the voting procedures of the UN system, and he didn't say this, but so I will interpret it, largely reflect the geopolitical landscape that emerged from World War II. If they are not reformed, I would suggest to you to reflect today's realities and tomorrow's challenges, they will be increasingly bypassed, and we will all be the worse for it. Understandably, the Security Council dominates the reform debate, but there are many other areas that we should be looking at as well. For instance, we should be engaging ministers more directly in the work of the UN bodies such as its Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, to breathe a little more realism and urgency into its deliberations. And if they cannot attract participation by ministers, political leaders within their own countries, then those who have to get elected, who are in the front lines and have to explain back home what they're doing, then that should tell us something about whether or not we need a more radical rethink about just how we want our major institutions to work. Well, let me just summarize by saying the following. The issue before us is how does the world resolve the policy dilemmas that pit worthwhile objectives against each other? Issue by issue, the stakes are high. The more important the subject, the more important the values that it engages. Seen holistically rather than piecemeal, the decisions that we make will determine whether all the advances that we have made in recent decades can work for everyone, or whether hundreds of millions of people, perhaps billions, will be left behind forever. If I've spoken today of the role that leaders must play, it is because domestically political leadership is an important catalyst for change. For instance, it is a subject one way or the other in every election campaign we go through. No candidate for public office would dare say to his or her voters that I'm going to ignore your problem or my officials will study it to death. Yet, that is precisely what too many of us say about the issues beyond our borders. And the question is, what is the future of global interdependence? And the answer will be found in the response provided by the political leadership in national capitals. One last point will also be found in the leadership of the people who are in this room. This room has the capacity to influence the course of events, not only here in Davos, but when you go back home. Most of the people in this room have benefited from the economic opportunities created by modern interdependence. We all have a stake in seeing international systems work well, but I firmly believe that they cannot work unless they work for the benefit of everyone. If we fail to make interdependence work, the consequences will be dire, and most of our children and grandchildren will lay the blame strictly at our feet. This is indeed the greatest challenge of our era. It's why the World Economic Forum is so important. It's clearly why the United Nations is at the center of our debates. For me, I remain now and forever an optimist. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for this comprehensive, I would say, global program, for this State of the World message. We will now have the pleasure to follow up those issues under the leadership of Prime Minister Paul Martin. I would like to invite the panel to join us here, and we will have an opportunity to discuss some of the very important proposals Prime Minister Paul Martin has made.
Pardon me, which do you push on? Which one do you push on? To get it to work. Just push on that to make it live. How do you make this live? It's live. Okay. Well, thank you very much. We will now begin the panel discussion. Just if I will introduce the panelists. At my far right is Bill Owens, who is the governor of Colorado, and according to this has been called the best governor in America by National Review magazine. That's not bad. Next to me is Kamal Kharrazi, the Minister of Foreign Affairs in the Islamic Republic of Iran. On my left, Arun, Shourie, the Minister of Communications and Information Technology of India. And at my far left, David Held, who is the Graham Wallis Chair in Political Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the United Kingdom. I'll call on the panelists to either react to what they've heard or to pretend they're going to react to what they've heard and totally make up something new. That is up to them, and I think I'll begin on my far right with Governor Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister, and it is a pleasure to be here. And I have been a regular participant for a number of years in Davos, and have always enjoyed these discussions. And I particularly appreciated the comments of the General Secretary and also of the Prime Minister this morning. Our topic is basically how to look into the future and perhaps divine what sorts of changes, if any, need to be made to make this world a better place in which for all of us to live and raise our families and hopefully do some business. As an American governor, I typically am not a participant on the international stage, though increasingly American governors are becoming more and more involved because of trade, because of the impact of essentially one world on all of our citizens. A couple of quick points, and I know we have some very distinguished panelists here, and our time is limited. Point number one, what I think we need to do in the future from my own perspective is increase and continue the efforts of international trade, because I think that trade leads to what John Kennedy talked about, the rising tide lifting all ships. It's clear that if you compare those decades when we did not have international trade compared to those decades when we have had significant trade, that generally speaking, people do better in a trading environment. The 1930s were years of high tariffs and little trade, and I would suggest that the 1930s helped us lead horribly into the decade of the 1940s with the problems and the wars that we saw. Since 1950, between 1950 and the year 2000, World Bank has done a study and has found that global trade in that 50-year period increased by a factor of 17 times. That because of that, GNP worldwide was up 7 times in that 50-year period, and because of that rising GNP, we saw a factor of 3 increase in world living standards. 1.1 billion Indians living better today by virtually any measure than they did a relatively few years ago. 1.3 billion Chinese no longer on the edge of subsistence, but able to start to become consumers. And while there are huge challenges remaining in the African continent, for example, around the world, trade is leading us in the right direction. And secondly, trade often leads to more liberal democracies. It often leads, as I think we're seeing in China and other countries, South Korea, Taiwan, where trade, where a rising standard leads to more liberal governments, more belief in the rule of law, and more rights for individuals. So I guess I would suggest that we do need to continue to encourage trade, because trade leads to that rising standard of living, and that rising standard of living often leads to more democratic governments. Democracies don't war against one another. That's almost just a given. Democracies don't have civil wars, because within those democracies you have the ability to take care of the issues before it leads to war. So I guess to my friends on the panel and to the Secretary General and the Prime Minister, I would hope that we would continue to do everything we can to encourage trade as a way to lead to a better environment, higher literacy, and increased world living standards for all the world's peoples.
Thank you, Governor. Minister Kharrazi.
Thank you very much. It is really my pleasure to participate in this very important panel after the speech of Secretary General and Your Excellency. I believe the theme of this Davos meeting is partnership, security, and prosperity. I remember the theme of Millennium Summit in the United States, in the United Nations, was better world. So the question is that how we can have a better world. I believe a better world can be achieved by partnership, security, and prosperity. The question is that how that can be handled. We believe that basically we have to promote democracy, and in parallel with promotion of democracies in nations, we have to promote democracy in global. In other terms, it is only through global civil society that we can have a better world, in which each nation, each democratic nation can play its own role and help for a better world. If you allow me, I would like to use a metaphor here. Being a student of cognitive science, I believe the metaphor of brain probably would help. In the brain, we have 100 billion cells, and each cell is interconnected with other cells with 10,000 wires. Therefore, altogether, we have 10,100 billion wires. It's huge. Our brain is very well interconnected. Having the Minister of Information Technology of India here, I believe this interconnection inside our brain provides us with the hardware, but there is a need of software as well. The software is the information, the knowledge that we have, and the consciousness that we produce. The consciousness of humanity and human brain is the product of the knowledge. It is interconnection. It is well-being of the mind which produces consciousness. If we use this metaphor in the case of global democracy, we believe that it fits very well. To have a global civil society and democracy, we need interconnection. We need interdependence. We need a free flow of financial resources. We need free flow of information. And we need respect for each other. It is only through dialogue and respect that each nation, with whatever culture it enjoys to have, as long as it is a democracy, as long as it's based on civil society, has to be respected and has to be given the room to play its role to prepare the ground for a better world. So as an opening remark, I wanted to share this with you.
Thank you very much. Minister Shourie.
Mr. Martin and my dear friends, the Secretary General said that the international environment has become less favorable even though interdependence has increased. And he mentioned the example, Mr. Martin mentioned the example of the trade talks, and also that the UN role and the UN Charter had come under strain and review. So this is my view really, my assessment is this is a yes and no position. Because if we see how the international community cooperated to react against a small crisis, immediate crisis like SARS, or the extent of cooperation that has come about since 9/11 on terrorism, it is actually, you will see the formation of an international networks of various kinds, of the kinds that you were mentioning. The initiative on landmines, the initiative on dealing with the debt problems of heavily indebted poor countries. These are examples of actually a responsive international structure. So it's important the key is to see why in some areas we have been able to react that way and why in other areas like trade, things have not gone far. And of course, you are right, sir, that the key is in frequent contacts between, frequent interminable contacts at the personal level between political leaders. But I personally feel that the situation is more complex. And it is not just that bureaucrats in Geneva have not been able to deliver or have taken a bureaucratic view of things. I'm the first time here in Davos, so I don't know if one is allowed to say, I told you so. But I was at the mini-ministerial conference. I'm just taking one example so that you and the Secretary General took on trade talks. I was at representing India at the mini-ministerial meeting in Sydney and then in Montreal. And I said in so many words that the way they were proceeding, they were scripting a catastrophe in Cancun. There was no doubt at all, because there was a presumption that if the United Nations and the European Council come to an agreement, even without figures, even in generalities, then the others will just have to fall in line. That is what didn't happen. Absolutely no progress was made on implementation issues. Absolutely no thought was spared for special and differential measures. The agreement that was produced at the 11th minute between the European Council and the United States on agriculture, there were so many difficulties. In Cancun, when almost 104 countries opposed a particular set of issues, the draft which came actually from the Canadian minister completely disregarded that and said something else. So naturally that led to what the Secretary General quite correctly called a backlash. I think that's the lesson we have to learn, that we have to be an international community, therefore we have to become a community in which we own a sense of universal responsibility, the consequences of our acts upon others, and in which we go through formulating rules, what is right, what is wrong, when can one country or a small group of countries act unilaterally, under what circumstances can they use what means to what extent, and the stirrings and debates that are going on now, sir, and which you said very correctly, that on which there should be an open discussion. Those things actually must address this rule formation. And the process must be such that everybody feels that his voice has been heard and that they are really fair. So there's a second point. This was implicit in the Secretary General's remarks about the World Social Forum. I think all of you are too impressed by numbers, by some figure of 80,000 people gathering. In India, if you change your tire, 10,000 people will watch you. So, and if you get 5,000 prostitutes to watch you, then 10,000 will come to watch them. So it is true. But I think there is an essential element in what World Social Forum and other activists are saying, and that is that their deliberations are sort of the inchoate expressions of the new rules by which we must abide, and we should listen to them with that openness of heart. Because interdependence offers enormous opportunities. The Iranian minister just mentioned information technology. $16 billion in an activity that India earns today, activity which we did not know of 10 years ago. But it requires preparation. So how to assist each other to prepare for that kind, to grapple with those, to take advantage of those opportunities. And education, health, all these have been frequently mentioned by the World Economic Forum. I would pay much greater attention to governance. There are parts of India which are able to take great advantage of interdependence with the world, opening up to the world. Others that are not. And the difference is the quality of governance in those areas. So my last point is about vulnerability. The more integrated our systems become, the more vulnerable also they become. A single hacker can destroy things. And there are countries whose strategic doctrine now aims at striking at what they call the acupuncture points of other societies on integrated power systems, integrated financial systems, integrated air traffic and rail traffic control systems. And this can be done just by planting viruses or other devices. So I would urge that we should pay much more attention how to safeguard the interdependent system against vulnerabilities of this kind. And the final point in vulnerabilities really is that change always dislocates. Now, because of your deliberations, Mr. Martin's advocacy and other things, the dikes are being lowered by each country. So change very far away, for instance in technology, comes to affect people who have not even heard of that change and they don't know what meteor has struck them. And for that reason, therefore change is not just manna which will come automatically and benefit everybody. We must, in addition to everything, think of how to build circuit breakers for instance, in the financial system. We must build structures which can respond swiftly. It's not just the Security Council, sir, but the deliberations that have been going on for 1 decade now on reformulating the role of IMF and the World Bank have really not reached the type of conclusion that would be required. But more than these structures is think of programs that can affect millions and raise the life of millions. Biofuels. In India, we've identified 120 non-edible oil seeds that grow in drought conditions in wastelands. Now, supposing we were to go for them in a very big way, then we would rehabilitate our wastelands, we would improve the incomes of millions, and we would improve ecology. And we would thereby safeguard them against opening up markets for European agricultural produce. So it is in this way that I think that we would all contribute to taking advantage of an interdependent system and at the same time getting more advocates for cooperation. And the key, sir, as you said, is frequent personal exchange between leaders and bureaucrats. Thank you.
Thank you. Every politician in this room has as a goal, has to pack halls, for big political rallies, and I must say that you've just given us a couple of new methods to pack a hall. And, Professor Held.
Well, I don't have to pack halls because my students generally have to attend. But I'm at a disadvantage here because academics usually require an hour to speak. That's the standard time for a lecture. And there are only a few moments. But I'd like to begin by thanking Paul Martin and Kofi Annan for their excellent presentations. And I'd like to particularly pay my respects to Kofi Annan's remarkable leadership at the United Nations. He is truly a great emperor, alas, without an empire. I think we need to distinguish, when we're talking about the future of interdependence, three things at least. We need to talk about the way in which the world is becoming more interconnected, and it is. We used to live in a world of national communities of fate, where nations determined largely their own fate. Today we live increasingly in a world of overlapping communities of fate, where the fate of each and every nation is tightly entwined one with another. We can map this in every area, from trade to the environment. But we need to distinguish the fact of interconnectedness from the issue of global social integration. We have interconnectedness, but we don't yet have common values and shared values. The only grand shared values we have in town, in the transnational town, are democratic values of self-determination and human rights. These are, as it were, what is left, it seems to me, at the beginning of the new century. They are profound and important, and yet clearly in many parts of the world they do not yet bite very deep. And finally, we need to distinguish interconnectedness and social integration, the sharing of values, from a commitment to social justice, remedying the position, as Kofi Annan has spoken, of the least well-off in the world. We score high on interconnectedness, less well on integration, and abysmally on social justice at the global level. I am actually an optimist, but I now feel like a pessimistic optimist, because over the last few months, over the last year, in fact, since I was last at Davos, it seems to me we face 4 interlocking threats to the rule-based multilateral order. The rule-based multilateral order is the basis of prosperity and security, as you often point out. But we face the collapse of the trade talks at Cancun. The trade talks are essential in improving the position of the least well-off. They have not made progress. We face the prospects of the failure of the Millennium Goals. The Millennium Goals are the moral consciousness of the international community, and it's not good when moral standards fail, because it breeds cynicism and skepticism. And yet, the World Economic Forum's own review of progress towards the Millennium Goals is food for sobering thought. Global warming. The chief scientist in Britain has recently said that global warming is a greater threat to humankind than global terrorism. That may or may not be true, but when you take the failure of the talks at Cancun, the problems of meeting the Millennium Goals, the lack of progress on global warming, the polar caps are melting, we face the loss of 1 million species within 50 years, and so on. This is very serious. And add to that the fallout of the war against Iraq. Whatever your position was on Iraq, and I was firmly against the war at that moment, nonetheless, the effect has been to further weaken multilateral institutions and the position of the UN and the role of the UN Charter. Now, does this mean that we are stymied by a set of 4 interlocking failures? I don't think so, because both Paul Martin and Kofi Annan have said something about what we need to do. I think in that sense the road is fairly clear. The extraordinary thing is that we're not moving along it at a faster speed. And let me just briefly conclude by highlighting a few, seems to me, critical issues to ensure that a more interconnected world is an integrated world and a just world. One is clearly Doha. It has to be a development round, or the world's poorest countries will not escape a trading system which does have double standards, rigged rules, and so on. We need, as Paul Martin says, to reform TRIPS. TRIPS is important, but it's got to be compatible with health and welfare objectives. We need to ensure that more countries meet the 0.7% in their GNP overseas aid target. Only 3 do. It's appalling. We need to continue the massive reduction of unsustainable debt. We can play with figures, but the world's poorest countries will not pay back these debts. So we should face it and create ways of channeling resources into the infrastructure of humankind. We need to improve cooperation among international institutions. Paul Martin has indicated this, where there is currently lack of cooperation between institutions and donors. We need to open up international organizations, especially international financial organizations like the Financial Stability Forum and the Basel Committee, to developing countries. And finally, we need to dislodge, as also Paul Martin has said, the 1945 geopolitical settlement at the heart of the UN system. Frankly, Europe is overrepresented, the developing world is unrepresented, and these institutions will not sustain legitimacy in the world unless we reach and face the issue of imbalances of power. Finally, one very last thought. You wouldn't build a state today with just market-driving institutions, because market-driving institutions are linked also to instabilities. But we've built a global order like that. We've built a global order where some of the leading institutions are the WTO, the IMF, and the World Bank, whatever trouble they might be in. We don't have countervailing institutions geared to poverty reduction, welfare, and the environment. You wouldn't build a nation-state like that. So why would you build a global order? And one final point is that it's often said we don't have the resources. This strikes me always as an academic to be hard to understand. The UN budget is 1.25 billion plus peacekeeping. Americans spend 27 billion every year on confectionery, 70 billion on alcohol, 600 million on cars. The same is true for Europe. The resources are there, but it's a question of choices. Thank you.
Let me just pick up on something that Professor Held said, and perhaps I could ask the panelists if they would like to react from it, his basic statement, and I'll take it just a bit further. The trade round has come to a halt. The debt relief thrust in terms of the heavily indebted poor countries promoted by the World Bank and the IMF has reached a plateau, but nothing further is being done on it at all. All of the drive that existed 3 to 4 years ago seems to have gone out of the movement. The state of our ability to deal with our common environmental problems is not progressing. The international funds that have been set up, the huge aid fund with such publicity is substantially undersubscribed. The push at Dakar to primary education for all by the year 2015 is largely stalemated. And there is a great risk, the governor talked about trade, there is a great risk that security is going to become the next non-tariff barrier. In other words, there are a lot of issues out there, and the great optimism and progress that we seem to be making really 5 years ago seems to be running into a wall. I guess the first question is that right? Is that unduly pessimistic? But if it's accurate, what is it we do about it? Who would like to begin?
Whoever you ask.
Governor?
I'd be glad to. First of all, I do remain an optimist, and yet I understand the challenges, and I'm not an international monetary expert, but there are a couple of underlying theses. Certainly, first of all, the last couple of years have been disruptive, perhaps disrupted by the real recognition of the impact that terrorism has played and could play on not just our nation states, but on our economies. Our friend from India pointed out that by focusing on a couple of intersections in terms of air traffic control, communications, perhaps other areas, that we are, because we're so interconnected, we're also more vulnerable to the terrorist threat. I believe that for years the terrorism threat was in fact there, but simply wasn't recognized, wasn't dealt with. And obviously, as an American, I understand that in many cases I'm in the minority within this forum and certainly around the world, but as a country that has chosen, with a lot of help from the world community, to bring the challenge of terrorism to the fore, it certainly, in many respects, made us also more vulnerable to international critique. 3 years ago when I was in Davos, we had a new American president, a gentleman who I've known for more than 30 years. And that new American president was a president who didn't have an extensive resume in international relations. And some of you came to me and said, you know, Bill, I hope the United States will remain engaged. Our forces were being, through joint agreement, removed from the Philippines. Subic Bay was being closed. Central Europe and Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia had been a topic of the American presidential election. There was a very significant concern around the world that the United States was going to disengage from the world, from the Pacific. I had friends from the Pacific say, we need the American presence in the Pacific, even though you're being removed from the Philippines. And only the United States perhaps can help us in Central Europe as you have been. So please tell this president we need to keep the United States engaged. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. is at its essence an isolationist country. I speak as an American governor who receives no votes because of my involvement in international relations. And the history of this last century has been a history of the United States, in many respects, being pulled into conflicts that it tried to avoid. World War I, World War II. My hobby is the history of the Cold War. Even the Cold War, I would submit, was a war that we got pulled into finally in 1948, when Prime Minister Attlee called Harry Truman and said, we can no longer maintain our sphere of influence in Greece, can you help? And so I realize that right now my country is in fact the focus of a lot of international criticism, but I also understand that there are times when in fact my country, in league with many other countries around the world, is a force for good. And it's important to remember that as we look at the challenges. I'm an optimist. I believe that we are far safer today than we were 5 years ago in terms of terrorism. It was just that then they were unrecognized as they based themselves in Afghanistan and in fact prepared to deal with the civilized world. And I appreciate the way the world has worked as a civilization to deal with this threat. But finally, Mr. Minister, I understand the economic challenges that remain ahead of us, though again, I think that the world is richer today on a per capita basis than we were 10 years ago, and I think the trend lines, in fact, even with the debt challenge, even with the collapse of the trade talks, that collapse may lead us to having the political will to get them back on track, albeit a year or 2 or 5 slower than we should have.
Thank you, Bill. Minister Kharrazi.
Yes, that is true that we are facing different challenges, security challenges, poverty challenges, disease challenges, all kinds of challenges. But the question is that how we have to meet these challenges. Naturally, as we are talking about an interdependent world, we have to work it out collectively to find ways and means how to meet these challenges. In that sense, as the Secretary General emphasized, and Your Excellency emphasized as well, the United Nations has to be at the center. Multilateralism has to be the approach. Therefore, we have to avoid any unilateral approach and stick to multilateral approach and think about whatever we do in one place certainly would have some effects in other parts of the world if we are talking about an interdependent world. Let me share with you a poem by Sa'di, one of the great poets of Iran, who lived more than 7 centuries ago. He says that, I read it first, it's Persian, and then translated it roughly. بنی آدم اعضای یکدیگرند که در آفرینش ز یک گوهرند چه عضوی را به درد آورد روزگار دیگر عضوها را نماند قرار, which roughly means we sons of Adam are part of one another as we are all from one substance. If the circumstances hurt one part, the other parts cannot remain unhurt. Therefore, we believe that we have to work collectively to resolve the issues and avoid unilateral actions. God forbidden, if our body needs a surgery, certainly we will put our body in the hands of a team of experts, a team of surgeons, not a butcher. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Minister?
Sir, I think, as was implicit in the remarks earlier, many things have unintended consequences. And the breakdown in Cancun reminds us that we must take care of the others' interests and actual concerns. Similarly, the action in Iraq and the consequences that have followed for the government in Britain, for the government of the US before the capture of Saddam Hussein, remind everyone that actually we should try to take everyone together even when people are very powerful. And in Cancun also, that the rules must not merely be the convenience of the powerful. They can't be. And that realization, I think, is at the heart of the matter. So you mentioned about terrorism. Every speaker has mentioned that there's been progress. But the fact of the matter is that till 9/11, no one was listening to the fact that this is a danger that is already devastating other countries. In India, about 65,000 people had been killed by terrorists. And whenever others came, we were asked to produce proof that this is the depredations of terrorists. So it should not take, the governor mentioned that the US is now awakened to this danger, but it should not take an incident like 9/11 to awaken us to this, nor should it be, the governor mentioned that there are no votes in taking care of the concerns of others. That's true, but there are no votes in India to take care of the concerns of American or European farmers. So we must realize that what the Sadi's poem says, what the Buddhist teacher says, that it is not just interdependence, it is interbeing, that we are in one another. And therefore we have a responsibility which must be not contingent upon whether we get votes for that or not. Unless political leaders have that sense of universal responsibility, sir, we will just keep talking. And that, I think, in operational terms, everybody talks of trade talks, so I mentioned that in operational terms, it means that in the richer countries, governments have to stand up to minuscule lobbies. One of the great contentious issues in Cancun, which almost brought things to a breaking point because it inflamed the African group, was that 4 countries were being devastated by subsidies on cotton. Actually, $3.5 billion being paid to 25,000 persons only. But if I cannot stand up to 25,000 persons, even if it devastates 4 countries, then, and that's the lure of votes, or if we have the courage to bear the other person's difficulties, that I can't reduce my agricultural subsidies because 1% of my population depends on it, but another country must open itself up for market access on those very products, even though 2/3 of that country depend on agriculture, and that 2/3 means 650 million. So unless we have that empathy and concern and the courage to bear not just the other fellow's difficulties, but to deal with our own lobbies and so on, I think we won't make the kind of progress that Mr. Martin and the Secretary General and everybody on the panel would want.
Thank you very much. We're going to give the last word, in fact, to Professor Held, and then we're unfortunately going to run out of time, but I think that's only right that a professor should actually find a solution that the politicians have had some difficulty with.
Well, if it was so easy, yeah. Let me pick up your question, Paul, by ending with a disagreement with the governor, a respectful disagreement with the governor of Colorado. I mean, you talk about the US as essentially an isolationist country. I want to say no to that in 3 respects. One is, in the post-45 world, the US exercised extraordinary leadership in helping to create a rule-based multilateral order. Secondly, person for person, it's surprising to know that actually the US public opinion is more sensitive to international issues than European public opinion on aggregate. It's surprising but true. Thirdly, your country was essentially autarkic, the economy was essentially autarkic 30 years ago or more. Today you are deeply enmeshed in the world's global order. So the US has exercised extraordinary leadership in the post-45 world order. It seems to me the challenge today is to re-engage you on a wider set of issues, the Millennium Goal, trade, global warming, the issues I talked about. But even on security, it seems to me the United States has become too hooked on a narrow conception of security, dealing with the issue of global terrorism, making war on terrorism. It's an important issue. Nobody could deny that. But we need to keep it in perspective. 3,000 people died on 9/11. Every day, 35,000 children die of poverty-related diseases that are avoidable. Billions of resources have been poured in after the deaths of 9/11. There are no comparable resources being poured in to alleviate this poverty and suffering. This is a straight set of choices, as I spoke about earlier. What we need is the US to engage in a wider framework of the security debate that isn't just narrowly focused on terrorism, but looks at the broader issues of human security. Because unless you look at the broader issues of human security, I don't think you'll solve the problem of terrorism either. Finally, I would just say, it's easy for us in Europe to say this to you. You have taken remarkable leadership role in the past on many issues. The EU has singularly failed in many respects to act effectively on the world stage. So this is a challenge to the EU as well. The EU has to increase its capacity to act with a single voice. The EU at the moment is not a multilateral institution, it's too often a multipolar institution, and it needs to act with more coherence and vision. And finally, the developing world found its voice in Cancun. The great powers of China, India, and Brazil acted with collaboration and some effectiveness to say no to the terms on the table presented by the USA and the EU. In my judgment, they were right to do so. And the best hope for the future is these powerful new voices act as a countervailing power to the single vision and the pursuit of particular interests of the USA and the EU. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Well, this brings the session to an end. I want to thank the four panelists. I thought they were very, very incisive, and I thought they were also very succinct. And I applaud all four of you. I wish we could have gone on. I would have liked to have given Bill a chance to respond to David. But your fundamental mistake, Bill, was in 1776. But I just want to say thank you all. Bye-bye.